My grandmother demanded I quit my job to care for her, saying, family duty comes first. When I refused, she cried to my parents, who accused me of being selfish and ungrateful. Hurt, I whispered, why am I the only one sacrificing? But when I discovered her hidden motive, I realized who she really wanted to hurt. This all started about a year ago when my grandmother, who I'll call Margaret, started having health issues. She's in her late 70s, still mobile, and fully capable of living independently, but she's always been the kind of person who enjoys having others wait on her. My whole life, I've watched her use guilt and manipulation to get her way. My dad, her son, always gave in, and my mom followed his lead. I was expected to do the same. I work full-time in finance, live in a city 3 hours away, and I love my job. I've worked my ass off to get where I am. Late nights, unpaid internships, surviving on cheap food in college, I put in the work. I make good money now, and I finally feel like I have control over my life. But Margaret had other plans. It started with small things. She'd call me, complain about how lonely she was, how hard it was to keep up with housework. Then she started suggesting I visit more often. Every phone call, it escalated. You should come home this weekend. You know, family should always come first. I just think it's sad that you're so focused on work when I'm all alone. I did visit when I could. I drove down on some weekends, helped her with errands, and spent time with her. But it was never enough. She wanted more. Then, one day, she dropped the bombshell. I want you to move back home and take care of me. I laughed at first. I thought she was joking. I said, Grandma, I have a job. I can't just quit and move in with you. Her face twisted like I had just slapped her. I took care of everyone in this family. It's time someone takes care of me. I told her she had options. She could hire a part-time caretaker, look into assisted living, or even just move in with my parents, who lived 15 minutes away. But Margaret didn't want solutions. She wanted control. No strangers in my home. I don't want to live with your mother, either. That woman never liked me. Then she turned on the waterworks. Tears. Shaking hands. Dramatic sighs. I guess I'll just die alone then. I stayed firm. I wasn't giving up my career to be her personal servant. I reminded her that I already helped whenever I could. But she wasn't listening. She just kept sobbing, saying I was abandoning her. I left that night feeling like the worst person in the world. I tried to push it out of my mind, but 2 days later, I got a call from my mom. Why are you being so cruel to your grandmother? I was stunned. My mom has never taken my side in arguments with Margaret, but this was next level. Apparently, Margaret had spent the past 2 days calling my parents nonstop, crying about how she has no one left in the world. She made it sound like I had told her to rot alone in her house and never call me again. I explained everything, how I had been visiting, helping, offering real solutions, but my mom didn't want to hear it. Family comes first. She's old. She doesn't have much time left. You're being selfish. I asked why my parents couldn't take her in if they were so concerned. We have our own lives. Oh, so their lives mattered, but mine didn't? That's when something inside me cracked. I asked my mom, why am I the only one expected to sacrifice? She had no answer. At this point, I was just exhausted. My dad started calling too, telling me to do the right thing. Even my aunt, who I barely spoke to, messaged me, saying I was a disappointment to the family. I stopped answering. If they wanted to believe Margaret's sob story, that was on them. Then I got a call from my cousin, Mark. He's one of the only family members I actually trust. He told me something that made my stomach drop. Dude, Grandma told everyone she's rewriting her will. I asked what that had to do with me. She's saying whoever takes care of her gets the house and all her savings. She told our parents she assumed it would be you. My blood went cold. Margaret wasn't just trying to guilt me into caring for her. She was dangling an inheritance over our heads to see who would bite. I went numb. The manipulation, the sobbing, the I'll die alone act. None of it was about love or family. It was about power. She wanted someone completely dependent on her, stuck catering to her every whim, because that's how she operated. She used money to control people. I told Mark I didn't give a damn about the inheritance, but I asked him to keep an eye on things. He agreed. That's when I decided I wasn't going to just walk away. Margaret had played her game. Now I was going to play mine. I started documenting everything. Every conversation, every message. I spoke to my boss and arranged to work remotely for a few weeks so I could be nearby without actually moving in. Then, I visited Margaret again, but this time, I was watching. I noticed something. She wasn't as helpless as she pretended to be. She exaggerated her struggles when people were around. If I walked into the kitchen, suddenly she couldn't reach the cabinets. But when she thought I wasn't looking, she moved around just fine. And the biggest red flag? She never actually asked for help with anything practical. She didn't need rides to the doctor. She didn't need groceries. She didn't need medication reminders. She just wanted control. Then, Mark called again. She's been saying some things about you, man. Turns out, Margaret had started spreading rumors that I was trying to take advantage of her, that I was pressuring her to move into assisted living so I could steal the house. She flipped the entire story. I realized then, this wasn't just about guilt. Margaret was actively trying to hurt me, and I wasn't going to let that slide. After that call from Mark, something inside me snapped. Margaret wasn't just guilt-tripping me, she was setting me up. She was playing the long game, turning my own family against me, making me look like the villain. And if I didn't do something soon, I had no doubt she'd get exactly what she wanted. So I did something I knew would push her buttons. I went no contact. For 2 weeks, I ignored her calls, her texts, her voicemails. I didn't reply to my parents either, even when my dad left me a furious voicemail saying, "You're breaking your grandmother's heart." I wanted to see what she would do when she didn't have me to manipulate. And sure enough, the moment I stopped playing along, she found a new victim. Mark called me again, and this time, he sounded shaken. "Dude, she's got Uncle Greg wrapped around her finger." Greg, my dad's younger brother, had always been kind of an outlier in the family. He wasn't as involved in the drama, mostly because he lived out of state. But apparently, Margaret had called him up, crying about how her own grandson has abandoned her in her time of need. And unlike the rest of us, Greg had money. Real money. Within days, he flew in, booked a hotel, and started personally taking care of Margaret, driving her to appointments, handling paperwork, even hiring housekeepers and contractors to fix up her place. And then Mark dropped the biggest bombshell. She's talking about putting him in the will instead. I nearly dropped my phone. Margaret had spent months guilt-tripping me, making me look like a monster, and now she was perfectly fine replacing me with a better option. It was never about family. It was always about power. And if she thought I was going to roll over and let her ruin my name, she had another thing coming. At this point, I had 2 goals: prove to my parents that Margaret was a liar, make sure she didn't get away with screwing me over. The first part was tricky. My parents had been in Margaret's grip for years. I needed something undeniable, something they couldn't ignore. So I started digging. With Mark's help, I got access to some of the paperwork Margaret had Uncle Greg working on. And what I found made my blood boil. She wasn't just updating her will. She was transferring assets. A house that had been in our family for generations. She was putting it in Greg's name. Her savings? Being moved into a joint account with him. She wasn't just rewarding Greg, she was erasing me. She wanted me gone. Completely. I knew I had to act fast. The next time I visited, I made sure it was unannounced. Margaret had no time to prepare, no chance to put on her helpless old lady act. And the moment she opened the door, I saw it. Annoyance. Not sadness. Not relief. Annoyance. Like I was a cockroach that had somehow found its way back inside. "Oh, you decided to come after all," she said, voice flat. I ignored the jab and stepped inside. And right away, I noticed something off. The house smelled new, like fresh paint. Furniture had been rearranged. The old, worn-down carpet had been replaced with hardwood. Margaret wasn't just updating her will. She was preparing to sell the house. And that's when I saw the folder sitting on the table. A thick, legal-looking folder with Greg's name on it. Margaret caught me looking and immediately snatched it up. "That's none of your business," she snapped. But it was exactly my business. Because this wasn't just about her cutting me out of the will anymore. She was about to sell a house that wasn't even hers to sell. I didn't lose my temper. I didn't yell. I just folded my arms and said, "So, Greg's the favorite now?" Margaret's eyes narrowed. "He's the only one who cares about me." I nodded slowly. "Right. And that's why you're putting everything in his name." For a split second, I saw panic flash across her face. She recovered fast, but not fast enough. "That's my choice," she said stiffly. "It has nothing to do with you." I let that sit in the air. I wanted her to realize what she had just admitted. She had fought so hard to guilt-trip me, to convince everyone I was abandoning her, and now, she was choosing to replace me. And I knew my next move. "Okay," I said, turning toward the door. "Where are you going?" "To talk to Dad." I didn't go to my dad right away. Instead, I went to Mark. We sat down, went over every document, every message, every voice recording. Yes, I had started recording conversations and put together a timeline of everything Margaret had done. Then, we called a family meeting. I made sure Uncle Greg was there. My parents. Even my aunt, who had been one of Margaret's biggest defenders. We all gathered in my parents' living room, and the moment Margaret walked in, she knew. She knew she had lost control. I didn't even have to say anything at first. I just handed my dad the folder. I watched as he flipped through it, his expression changing with every page. First confusion. Then disbelief. Then anger. Margaret started backpedaling immediately. "That's not what it looks like." But my dad wasn't listening. He turned to Greg. "You were going to let her do this?" Greg, who had been completely in the dark, looked just as shocked. "I thought she owned the house." "She didn't. It was still under my dad's name." Margaret had spent months manipulating everyone, and now the whole family was watching her lies fall apart. And for the first time in my life, my parents saw her for what she really was. A liar. A manipulator. And someone who was willing to throw me away the second a better option came along. And I wasn't done yet. The silence in my parents' living room was thick. My dad kept flipping through the documents, his face growing darker with every page. My mom had her hands clutched together, her lips pressed in a tight line. Uncle Greg was staring at Margaret like she was a stranger. Margaret, though? She was already shifting into damage control mode. "This is all a misunderstanding," she said quickly, her voice shaking just enough to sound pitiful. "I never meant to hurt anyone. I was just making sure I had someone I could rely on." She reached out, as if trying to pat my dad's hand, but he pulled away. I'd never seen that before. My dad, who had always been her biggest defender, pulling away from her. That's when I knew this was working. But just as I was about to press the advantage, Margaret played her next move. She turned to Greg, tears welling in her eyes. You don't believe them, do you? Greg hesitated. I saw it. He wasn't fully convinced yet. He wasn't a bad guy, but he had been sucked into Margaret's version of events. He had spent weeks taking care of her, believing she was helpless, alone, abandoned. So I went in for the kill. Greg, I have a question, I said, keeping my voice calm. Did Margaret ever mention to you that she'd begged me to quit my job and take care of her? That she spent months trying to guilt me into it? Greg frowned. No. Did she tell you that I did visit, that I did help, but it was never enough for her? He shook his head. Did she tell you that the moment I refused to quit my job, she decided you were the better grandson and started rewriting everything in your favor? Now Greg looked uncomfortable. He shifted in his seat, his eyes flicking back to Margaret. And then I played my trump card. Did she tell you she was planning to sell the house before the paperwork was even done? Greg's face went white. Because he knew. He had been helping her hire contractors. He had been lining up buyers. And he had no idea it wasn't even legally hers to sell. Margaret saw the realization hit him. And that's when she panicked. I was going to give you part of it, she blurted out. Silence. Greg leaned forward, his voice low. You told me you were leaving everything to me. Margaret flinched. Greg exhaled sharply, rubbing his face. He looked genuinely hurt. He had spent thousands of dollars on travel, on fixing up her house, on medical appointments she didn't even need. And now, he realized that Margaret had been playing him, too. She had never planned on keeping him around forever. He was just another tool. And that was when my dad snapped. Enough, my dad said, his voice cold. Mom, you need to leave. Margaret stiffened. What? I'm done. Margaret's face crumbled. She turned to my mom, her usual backup, but my mom wasn't meeting her eyes. You don't mean that, she whispered. I'm your mother. Yeah, my dad said, standing up. And you've been lying to me for years. Now that caught Margaret off guard. Years? My dad exhaled, rubbing his forehead. I should have seen it sooner. Every time there was a fight in this family, you were in the middle of it. You turned us against each other. You made sure we all depended on you. And the second someone didn't do what you wanted, you threw them away. Margaret opened her mouth, but my dad cut her off. Get out of my house. I could tell she was about to throw a tantrum. Her face twisted, her hands curled into fists, but this time, no one was buying it. Greg stood up, too. I want my money back, he said coldly. Margaret froze. All the money I spent taking care of you, on your house, on your medical needs, I want it back. And now she looked truly scared. Because Greg had money. Money for lawyers. Money to take her to court. She turned to my parents. You're not going to let them talk to me like this, are you? My mom sighed. Mom, you did this to yourself. Margaret left that night. But I knew her. She wasn't done. She wouldn't accept that she had lost. And sure enough, the next day, she tried to turn it around. She went to her church. She went to family friends. She told everyone that we had abandoned her, that we were trying to take everything from her. It was the same act she had pulled before. But there was a difference this time. This time, we had proof. Greg lawyered up. I exposed her lies to every relative she tried to manipulate. My parents cut her off financially. And slowly, her empire of guilt started crumbling. She started calling less and less. The messages stopped. And then, one day, she disappeared. For months, we didn't hear from her. Not a word. It was like she had vanished. We thought maybe, just maybe, she had finally given up. But then, one day, my dad got a call. Margaret had moved in with a cousin in another state. And guess what? She had already started the cycle all over again. New victim. New lies. New helpless old lady act. And this time, she was marrying an old widower. A man who just happened to be filthy rich. Margaret wasn't just looking for a caretaker anymore. She was going for everything. And I knew, this wasn't over yet. Margaret had always been a master manipulator, but this time, she had gone nuclear. She wasn't just leeching off family anymore. She had found a new mark. A wealthy widower in his 80s, living in another state. The kind of man who was vulnerable, lonely, and likely had no one questioning his decisions. At first, we weren't sure if she was just mooching off him or if she had a bigger plan. Then we found out. She was marrying him. Margaret was going for the jackpot. When my dad got the news, he didn't even sound surprised. Of course she is, he muttered. She's finally found her perfect setup. Some poor old guy who doesn't know what he's getting into. Greg, though, he was pissed. She's doing it again. She's going to bleed this guy dry, and then what? She finds another. At first, I told myself I didn't care. Margaret was out of our lives. She wasn't our problem anymore. But the more I thought about it, the more it ate at me. Because this time, it wasn't just about money. This time, she was messing with someone who probably didn't have much time left. And I couldn't let her do that. The wedding was set to be a small, private ceremony. Nothing extravagant. Margaret wasn't flashy like that. She liked control. She wanted something intimate, where no one could question her. But she made one crucial mistake. She invited family. Not me. Not Greg. But a few distant relatives, some of whom had started catching on to her lies. And thanks to them, We found out where it was happening, and we showed up. The ceremony was held in a small church, something humble, just how Margaret liked it. But when we arrived, I saw her through the window, standing at the altar, holding the hand of a frail-looking man with wispy white hair. She was smiling. Not the teary-eyed, emotional smile you'd expect at a wedding. No, this was her victory smile. She thought she had won. And that's when we walked in. Margaret's head snapped up the moment we entered. Greg went first. Loud, direct, unapologetic. You really think you can do this again, Margaret? Gasps rippled through the small gathering. The groom turned, confused. The officiant stopped mid-sentence. A few relatives started whispering. Margaret? Her face blanched. What are you doing here? She hissed. I stepped forward, holding up a folder. We just wanted to make sure your new husband knows exactly who he's marrying. The groom, Mr. Delaney, looked completely bewildered. What is this? Margaret tried to grab the folder out of my hands, but I pulled it back. This? I said, flipping it open. This is a record of every time you've done this before. How you manipulate people. How you used your own family. How you nearly stole a house that wasn't yours. And now, you're doing it again. Her mask cracked. That's a lie, she shrieked. They're just trying to ruin my happiness. But Mr. Delaney wasn't stupid. He took the folder from me and started flipping through it. His hands shook. His face turned pale. And then, in a quiet, trembling voice, he asked, Margaret, is this true? I swear, for a split second, I saw something in Margaret's eyes. Not regret, not guilt, rage. Because this moment, was what she feared the most. The truth. You don't understand, she snapped. They've always been against me. They're just jealous because you actually love me. They want me to be miserable. My dad stepped forward, shaking his head. No, Mom. We just want you to stop hurting people. Margaret turned to Mr. Delaney, desperate now. She tried to hold his hand, but he pulled away. You don't believe them, do you? She pleaded. Mr. Delaney looked up at her, and in a quiet, devastatingly calm voice, he said, I think you should leave. Margaret staggered back like she had been slapped. What? No, you, leave, he repeated. The room was dead silent. No one spoke. No one moved. And for the first time in her life, Margaret had no one left to manipulate. Margaret didn't leave gracefully. She left screaming, calling us ungrateful, calling us monsters, accusing Mr. Delaney of betraying her. But no one stopped her. No one followed. And when she finally stormed out of that church, slamming the doors behind her, I knew she had lost. Mr. Delaney canceled the marriage that day. He was heartbroken, embarrassed, humiliated. But in the end, he was grateful we stopped him before it was too late. Margaret? She vanished. No one heard from her for months. She cut off all contact, probably hoping we'd come crawling back. We didn't. And when she finally did reach out, it wasn't to apologize. It was to ask for money. She had burned every bridge, and now, with nowhere to go, she was desperate. But for the first time ever, my dad didn't give in. He ignored the messages. And so did we. I'd love to tell you Margaret had some big moment of redemption, that she saw the error of her ways, that she changed. But she didn't. Margaret wasn't capable of change. She lived the rest of her life bouncing from distant relatives to old friends, always trying to find her next source of support. But the older she got, the less people wanted to take her in. And in the end, she died alone. No grand send-off. No loving family by her side. Just a bitter old woman, trapped in the world she built for herself. And as much as I hated her, when I got the news, I felt nothing. No relief. No sadness. Just nothing. Because Margaret had been dead to me for a long time. And now, she could never hurt anyone again. I used to think family was everything. That no matter what, you had to stick together. But Margaret taught me a hard truth. Family isn't who you're born to. It's who chooses you. And for the first time in my life, I was finally free.